The air was so cold it felt solid. It was 1978 at a Soviet PVO radar station near Murmansk on the Barents Sea. This was the northernmost sentry post of the Soviet Union, the digital tripwire for the entire Rodina. Inside the green-lit van of a P-14 tall KêNH, early warning radar operators huddled in thick coats sipping bitter tea watching for ghosts. Their job was to stare at a circular screen, watching for the faint electronic pulse of an American B-52 bomber. It was a job defined by hours of profound boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. At 03:17 a.m. the terror arrived. A young conscript, his eyes heavy, snapped upright. He wasn't the first to see it. His lieutenant was already pointing, his voice tight. Azimuth, azimuth. The contact was not a ghost. It was too fast, too clean. It was moving at a speed that defied logic at an altitude the manuals said was impossible. The P-14 radar, a massive barn door-sized array, was designed to find bombers. This was not a bomber. This was a missile. But it wasn't decelerating. It wasn't arcing towards a target. It was flying a straight, arrogant line right along the edge of their airspace. The station commander was on the line in seconds, shouting, "Status target type." The lieutenant could only relay the data. Altitude 25,000 meters, speed Mach 3.1, silence on the line. 25,000 meters. That was over 82,000 feet. Mach 3.1. That was more than 2,300 miles per hour. No missile flew like that. No aircraft flew like that. But it was an aircraft, and it was real. The entire air defense network of the Kola Peninsula roared to life. This was not a test. This was the moment they had trained for. The tall KêNH radar handed the target off to the SA-5 Gammon missile battalion. This was the Soviet Union's premier high-altitude weapon, a two-stage monster the size of a telephone pole built for exactly this purpose. A launch order was given. In a storm of fire and smoke, a 10-ton missile clawed its way into the Arctic sky, accelerating to Mach 4, a silver needle racing to kill the impossible ghost. In the command bunker, the operators watched their screens. The missile's radar tracker, a square pair, was active. The intercept course was perfect. The missile climbed 50,000 feet, 60,000, 70,000, and then the ghost moved. On the screen, the target's data block, which had been tracking at a steady Mach 3.1, simply changed. Speed, Mach 3.3, Mach 3.4. The ghost wasn't evading. It wasn't turning. It wasn't diving. It was accelerating. The SA-5 missile, straining at the peak of its flight envelope, reached its apex. It was now losing energy, bleeding speed in the thin, frozen air. The ghost, now pulling away, simply flew past it. The missile, its tiny electronic brain screaming in futility, detonated harmlessly in the empty sky miles behind its intended target. In the command bunker, no one spoke. The ghost held its course for another 3 minutes, a searing electronic scar across their radar screens. And then it was gone. Vanished over the horizon. It had not been an attack. It had been a message. It was a demonstration of utter terrifying and casual contempt. The most sophisticated, dense, and layered air defense system on Earth had been rendered completely, hopelessly powerless. And the men who had just failed to defend their country, they had just had their first encounter with the SR-71 Blackbird. This was not an isolated incident. This was the norm. For 25 years, from the skies over North Vietnam, to the borders of North Korea, from the deserts of the Middle East, to the frozen wastes of the Arctic, this one aircraft operated with complete and total impunity. This is not just the story of a fast airplane. This is the story of a profound philosophical and doctrinal failure. It is the story of how the Soviet Union, a superpower built on the idea of a massive, impenetrable shield, was haunted, humiliated, and ultimately proven obsolete by a single machine they could never, ever touch. The Soviet Union's military doctrine was built en masse. Thousands of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and most importantly, thousands of surface-to-air missiles. The Vojska PVO, the Air Defense Forces, was its own branch of the military equal to the Army or Navy. They had one job: to create a wall of steel that would bleed any attacker white. It was a fortress, a layered, overlapping, dense network of radars and missiles of every type. From the short-range SA-8s protecting tanks to the medium-range SA-2s and SA-3s that had drawn blood in Vietnam, all the way up to the terrifying long-range SA-5s designed to kill high-altitude bombers. This system was their pride. It was their guarantee, and the SR-71 Blackbird made a mockery of it. While the F-15 Eagle and the AWACS system, which we discussed in another video, proved the Soviet ground-controlled intercept doctrine for fighters was a failure in wartime. The SR-71 proved their entire air defense doctrine was a failure every single day in peacetime. The F-15 was a killer. The SR-71 was a ghost that could fly through the front door of the Kremlin, photograph their most secret bases, and be home before they could even scramble a jet. This was not a technological gap. This was a chasm. It was an ideological insult, a 2,000-mile-per-hour black dagger pointed at the heart of their entire system, and the Kremlin could not tolerate it. The order from Moscow was simple and desperate: build me a machine that can kill this ghost. The Soviet design bureaus, brilliant and paranoid, scrambled to respond. They knew about the American Blackbird, though they didn't know its real designation. They also knew about the American B-17 Valkyrie, a monstrous Mach 3 bomber project. The panic was total. The Americans were building a fleet of uninterceptable aircraft. The response was a machine born of pure distilled paranoia. It was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat. This aircraft was in itself a Soviet miracle. It was not a copy. It was a reaction. And it was built to do one thing and one thing only: fly high, fly fast, and kill the Blackbird. Since they couldn't get titanium in the quantities needed, the engineers at MiG did something insane. They built it out of steel, nickel-steel alloy. It was a 30-ton flying iron girder welded together by hand. It didn't have sophisticated, efficient engines. It had two monstrous Tumansky R-15 turbines originally designed for a high-altitude cruise missile. These engines were effectively fuel pumps that turned kerosene into raw, terrifying thrust. It didn't have a sophisticated radar. It had the Smerch-A, the most powerful airborne radar ever put on a fighter. It weighed half a ton and burned with so much power, 600 kilowatts, that it was rumored it could kill a rabbit on the runway 1,000 yards away. It was a brute force solution, and in warranty 1967 it seemed to work. The MiG-25 set world records for speed, altitude, and time to climb. It could, in a desperate sprint, punch through Mach 3. It could reach 90,000 feet. On paper, it was the Blackbird killer the Kremlin had demanded. But here we see the profound, fatal difference between imitation and innovation. The MiG-25 was a paper tiger. Yes, it could reach Mach 3, but only for a few minutes. If a pilot pushed it past Mach 2.8, the massive R-15 engines would tear themselves apart, literally melting. If they did survive, the ground crew would have to replace them. The plane wasn't designed to cruise at Mach 3. It was designed to die at Mach 3. It was an interceptor, a point defense weapon. It would sit on the ground, wait for the SR-71 to fly overhead, and then launch in a desperate suicidal sprint fire its massive 200-pound missiles and prey. The SR-71, on the other hand, was built to live at Mach 3. It could cross the entire United States in 67 minutes, refuel, and do it again. The MiG-25 was a brilliant piece of reactive engineering. The SR-71 was a new philosophy. The Soviets had built a steel shield. The Americans had built a ghost, and that ghost was about to fly into its most dangerous test. Not over the frozen Arctic, but over the hot, deadly sands of the Mediterranean. The date is April 14th, 1986. The place Libya. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, flush with Soviet military hardware, had declared the Gulf of Sidra his line of death. He was sponsoring terrorism across Europe, and President Ronald Reagan had decided to respond. The operation was called El Dorado Canyon. It was a complex multi-service strike. F-111 bombers from the UK Navy, A-6 intruders from carriers, all striking at the heart of Gaddafi's regime. But the most critical part of the mission was not the bombing. It was the after. The battle damage assessment. Reagan needed to know, did we hit our targets? And there was only one machine on Earth that could fly into the hornet's nest after the hornets had been kicked and get out alive. Flying out of RAF Mildenhall in the UK, two SR-71 Blackbirds call signs, Ashes 01 and Ashes 02, made their way south. Their mission, a high-speed daylight pass over Tripoli and Benghazi after the strike to photograph the wreckage. They knew Gaddafi was armed to the teeth, and he was armed by the Soviets. He had a dense, integrated air defense system identical to what protected Moscow itself. And he had the export version of the very missile that had been fired at the Blackbird over Murmansk, the SA-5 Gammon. This was the test. The MiG-25s were a failure. But could the premier Soviet high-altitude missile, in the hands of a furious and alert enemy, finally kill the ghost? As the SR-71 flown by, pilot Major Brian Schul crossed the line of death, the sky erupted. Gaddafi's commanders, alerted by the earlier F-111 strikes, were waiting. Their Soviet-made radars locked on. This was not a 3 a.m. Arctic surprise. This was a prepared, wide-awake, and vengeful enemy. Inside Schul's cockpit, his defensive systems panel lit up like a Christmas tree. His reconnaissance systems officer in the back seat, Major Walter Watson, called it out, his voice calm but electric. Launch, multiple launch, SA-5s. From the ground, Libyan crews watched as their missiles, the pride of the PVO, roared into the sky. They were tracking a perfect target, a solid gold lock. On his radar scope, Watson saw them multiple supersonic telephone poles climbing at astonishing speed, arcing directly towards them. They were coming from multiple sites, a perfectly timed salvo designed to box them in. This was the moment of truth. In a MiG-25, the pilot would be forced to disengage. In an F-15, he'd be in a desperate fight for his life. In an SR-71, the procedure was different. Brian Schul was not taught to turn. He was not taught to dive. He was not taught to deploy chaff or flares. The only defensive maneuver in the SR-71 operations manual for a missile threat was one word: accelerate. Schul and Watson were already at Mach 3. Schul's gloved hand pushed the throttles forward into their afterburner detents, and the Ghost did what it did best. It moved. The two massive Pratt & Whitney J58 engines, which had been breathing in the air at 2,000 miles per hour, now began to truly work. The plane, instead of straining, settled in. It was now flying in the environment it was built for. On the ground, the Libyan radar operators watched in disbelief. The target they were tracking, the target their Mach 4 missiles were straining to reach, was pulling away. The missiles climbing into the thin air, their rocket motors burning out, simply couldn't keep up. They were defeated by pure, brutal physics. They reached their apex 90, 100,000 feet. And then one by one they nosed over and began the long, silent fall back to Earth, defeated. They detonated either by self-destruct or on impact with the desert miles behind the Blackbird. Schul and Watson, now at Mach 3.5, over 500 miles per hour, were silent in their pressure suits, watching the curvature of the Earth as they flew untouched over the burning wreckage of Tripoli. They had flown directly into the most sophisticated air defense kill box outside of the Soviet Union, and it hadn't laid a finger on them. The Ghost was, and remained, untouchable. The question that baffled the Kremlin for decades was, how? To understand how, you have to go back. Not to a military base, but to a nondescript building in Burbank, California. A place with no sign, known only as the Skunk Works. And you have to understand its legendary leader, Kelly Johnson. Johnson was a cantankerous, brilliant, and utterly ruthless engineer. He lived by a simple motto: be quick, be quiet, and be on time. When the CIA came to him after the U-2, his last masterpiece was shot down over the Soviet Union, they asked for the impossible. They needed a new spy plane, one that could fly with impunity. Johnson's team looked at the problem. The Soviet SA-2 missile, the one that got the U-2, could reach 60,000 feet. The new SA-5 could go even higher. The answer, they realized, was not just altitude. It was speed. Not just fast, but impossibly fast. Faster than the missiles. So fast that by the time a radar saw you and a commander gave the order to fire and the missile climbed to your altitude, you were already 100 miles away. They designed a plane that would live at Mach 3.2 at 85,000 feet. But to do that, they had to invent, well, everything. First, the problem of heat. At Mach 3.2, the air friction would heat the skin of the aircraft to over 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Aluminum would melt. Steel, as the Soviets used, was too heavy. The answer was titanium, a rare, notoriously difficult metal that no one had ever built a plane out of. The Skunk Works had to invent new tools, new ways to work it, because at 800 degrees, the titanium skin would be stronger than steel. In fact, the plane was designed to expand. They built it loose on the ground. The panels had gaps. The SR-71 was the only plane in the Air Force that had to take off leaking. It would leak its specialized JP-7 fuel all over the runway. It had to get airborne fly fast to heat up and seal its own gaps, and then immediately refuel in the air. It was designed to be perfect only when it was at its most impossible speed. Second, the engine. A normal jet engine, a turbojet, can't breathe at Mach 3. The air is coming in too fast. It would blow the turbines apart. A ramjet is perfect at Mach 3, but it can't take off from a standstill. So Pratt & Whitney in secret built the J-58. The J-58 was not an engine. It was a system. It was a hybrid, a turbo ramjet. At takeoff, it was a mostly normal turbojet. But as the plane accelerated past Mach 1.6, a complex series of doors and tubes would activate. A massive cone in the front of the engine, the spike, would move backward. This spike would control the shock wave, literally swallowing it. The engine would stop being a turbojet and become a ramjet. Most of the air would bypass the engine core, completely mixing with fuel and afterburner flame, turning the entire engine into a giant, continuous, controlled explosion. This is the genius. The J-58 engine became more efficient the faster it went. It was a thermodynamic miracle. Third, the ghostly signature. The SR-71 is from the 1960s, before stealth was a word. But Kelly Johnson knew that a high-speed, high-altitude target was also a high-priority target. He had to make it hard to see. The shape of the plane, those sweeping Chinese on the side, wasn't just for aerodynamics. It was to reduce the radar cross-section. The vertical tails were slanted inward to avoid reflecting radar waves. And the paint, that famous Blackbird paint. It wasn't black just to look menacing. It was a special iron ball paint infused with tiny iron spheres designed to absorb radar energy and dissipate it as heat. It was not a stealth plane like the F-117. It was just a terrible radar target. It would appear and disappear from screens, a ghost that was almost impossible to lock onto. This then was the machine, a titanium-skinned ramjet-powered radar-absorbing ghost. But the machine was only half the story. The final piece of the puzzle, the one the Soviets truly never understood, was the philosophy. The Soviet military was built on a rigid, top-down, centralized command. The general in the bunker gave the orders. The pilot was an instrument. The missile crew was a switch. The SR-71 program was the opposite. It was a system built on innovation, flexibility, and trust. The Soviet mistake for 25 years was that they thought they were fighting a fast plane. They were not. They were fighting a new doctrine. The SR-71's defensive systems were not weapons. They were ideas. First, as we saw, was physics, speed and altitude. The plane's very existence was its primary defense. It flew outside the envelope of 99% of the threats on Earth. Second was electronic warfare. For the 1% that could reach it, like the SA-5, the SR-71 carried a sophisticated automated electronic countermeasures suite. It could analyze an incoming radar beam, determine its type, and automatically broadcast a perfectly timed jamming signal to confuse the missile's guidance. The Libyans didn't just miss. They were actively tricked. And third, the most important, the pilot's doctrine. The only defensive maneuver was accelerate. This is a profound philosophical statement. It is a doctrine of pure, unadulterated, technological superiority. It says the machine you are in is so far beyond your enemy's ability to comprehend that their only weapons, their missiles, their jets, are simply irrelevant. You will not fight them. You will not honor them with a dogfight. You will simply push the throttle forward and leave them and their entire military philosophy behind in your wake. The verdict is written in the history books. Over the 25-year operational life of the SR-71 Blackbird and its predecessors, it is estimated that over 4,000 missiles were fired at it. From SA-2s over Vietnam to SA-5s over Libya, the number of Blackbirds lost to enemy action 0. Just like the F-15's stunning 104-0 combat record, the SR-71's untouchable legacy is not just a statistic. It is a judgment. It is the final unassailable verdict on an entire generation of military thought. The Soviet Union's MiG-25 Foxbat was a brilliant reaction. It was a masterpiece of imitation warfare. But that was the trap. The Soviets were always copying the last war's masterpiece. While Soviet engineers were perfecting the act of building a steel interceptor, American engineers at Skunk Works were defining the next war. While the Soviet system poured its soul into mass and quantity, the American system at its best was capable of a qualitative leap so profound the enemy didn't even know how to begin to copy it. The mystery that the Soviet radar operator confronted in that frozen Arctic bunker was not just a fast-moving blip. The phantom that haunted the Kremlin was not a piece of hardware. It was an idea. It was a 2,000-mile-per-hour reminder flying high in the stratosphere that their entire system, their prized, dense, and suffocatingly rigid air defense network was a relic. The Blackbird was the future. And it had arrived to prove with every arrogant, untouchable flight that the Soviet Union was already history. They just didn't know it yet.